Welcome to episode 28 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hello.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different feature topic each episode. New episodes are out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. Ratings and reviews are appreciated, and you can drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening, and now it's time to introduce our featured topic and our guest for this episode.
We use the C word a lot on Ping, configuration. But up until now, we've just tackled the consequences of bad ones. That firewall configuration errors cause almost all of the world's problems, with network performance, security breaches, etc. So how do you know what a good configuration looks like for your particular network needs? After all, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. And how do you get one if you're not a firewall whiz yourself?
To drop more of his vast configuration and networking knowledge on us, we welcome back friend of the program, Anthony Merchaud, Director of Sales here at Firewalls.com. Anthony, thanks very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Appreciate it.
So we'll jump right into our configuration issue of the day. We've talked about configuration here and there throughout the course of our podcast, but we haven't really taken a deep dive. So that's what we want to do here today. And so one of the first things that happens when somebody gets a new appliance is they pop open the box and they have the option of using the old configuration wizard once they plug it in and get it up and running. So is that a good idea to take advantage of that?
Oh, no. In a word, no. So, a lot of the manufacturers all have some kind of a wizard, and it's probably something that needs to be buried in the past. And it's a nice idea at first glance, but when you really think about every business and what they do and how they do it, no matter the vertical they're in, whether it's education or government or bank or small business or enterprise business, every single business is different in how they use the firewall and how things need to be set up so that it gives them the best performance and meets their needs for their specific environment. So a wizard is a cool word and a nice idea in theory, but in practice, it's almost never a good idea type of scenario where you probably end up having to come back and fix more things and spend more time untangling than it would have, ultimately cost you upfront, or to have somebody who's an expert actually dive into that and give you the best possible setup and solution.
So what are some individual factors people should be considering with the configuration that maybe the wizard doesn't nail that first go around?
Yeah, the first thing that, of course, that we like to cover is security. And the more things, the more policies, the more rules, the more holes that you have in your network, which is all ultimately controlled by the firewall, the more exposed you're going to be. And general rule of thumb is you don't want to be the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest target for any kind of a hacker or criminal or somebody trying to infiltrate your network and cause destruction. You don't want to be the lowest hanging fruit. And the first thing that would probably lead you to being low hanging fruit might be something like a standard generic wizard configuration. And, really like I said before, the differences between all of, the different businesses and solutions out there. Generally, you're going to have a lot of specifics in your config. So things like segmenting your network, keeping the accounting resources only accessible to accounting, keeping the CRM and sales data strictly controlled and operated by only those people that need to be in there. Or maybe you get something where you have some IP, some intellectual property that, you really don't want to have anybody that doesn't need to be accessing it or have access to it to be able to get to it. So that's probably the biggest thing is protecting your data. If something were to happen, which you hope it doesn't, and you hope you've prepared for that and prevented as many low-hanging fruit scenarios as possible. But if something were to happen, to keep your mission critical pieces of the business segmented from each other.
Right, so sort of like a ship where if you have a leak in one area, you can kind of seal that compartment off and it won't spread too badly and sink the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good analogy, and ultimately every section of the ship that does take on water can still, even if you have things segmented, can obviously still bring the ship down, but giving you as much time to react and make the appropriate adjustments, whether that's with your end users or with your configuration, is key.
Yeah, kind of an interesting point that you just brought up too, with the low-hanging fruit aspect. I mean, you would think that maybe attackers also know some of the standard wizard configurations out there and know exactly what to do to exploit those.
Yeah, I mean, these guys are professionals. It's a business. It's an unethical business, but it's business. So it's a time versus reward scenario. And the more protected, the more locked down your network, which is all controlled by the firewall, by the gateway, the better protected you're going to be, because it ends up being more of a time sink than what they might get if they have the next piece of low-hanging fruit that isn't as well protected, takes a lot less time to infiltrate, deploy ransomware, get paid for that ransomware deployment by the business in the same amount of time that it might take you to even break into something. So it's a risk versus reward, or time versus reward, for those people engaging in that type of business, but you don't want to be the low-hanging fruit.
So I imagine these configuration wizards exist because somebody opens the box, they want to get it up and running, they don't want to have to hire out specific certified engineers to come do this. So how likely is it to nail a perfect configuration if you're going into this with only sort of general IT knowledge and you're not an expert yourself?
I guess I would say close to impossible, because most scenarios you're not going to have a set and forget. You hit it on the first try and that's it. We're done here for the next 10 years. There's always going to be something that requires additional attention, expertise, knowledge, experience, all of those things that come into play more than just, I would assume if you're using a wizard, then you're not well versed in all of the nuances of the firewall. So you're going to have stuff that you need to revisit. And using a wizard, that's not an option. There is no checkup wizard that right. runs every month or something like that. And, businesses, their needs change, and sometimes you have to open a port to give certain applications or people access, and then that's just a temporary thing. So if you open it from the get-go, it's going to stay open forever. And that is a door that, a malicious attack can use as a gateway to get in and cause destruction. And the wizard doesn't account for future and ongoing changes.
Yeah, so basically the allure of the wizard is that you get your firewall, you plug it in, you get up and running, and you want to get up and running right away. You're like, okay, I got my firewall. Let's just follow the wizard and here we go. But you really need to make that investment of time and maybe money up front to save time and maybe money down the road.
Yeah, and time is money. So that, just like the unethical, hacker wants to spend as little time and get as big a reward as possible. Same scenario here, you have to put in the time and the money sometimes to get these things set up correctly. And I think anybody that's lacking expertise in any field that tries to, undertake changing their transmission in their garage is probably going to spend 10 times the amount of time as a professional mechanic that can get in and get out and give you a really good solution as fast as possible. So ultimately, it can cost you a lot more time down the road, even though the wizard's a few clicks. It ultimately will cause you more time and money down the road. But that is the scenario. So that's why paying somebody a professional, qualified expertise, it could save you a lot of time. They can do it in 1 to 3 days, where it's going to take you 2 to 3 weeks. That's ultimately going to cost the company money, of your time, of your resources, where if you're an IT admin, there's a lot of other fires and things that are, hitting your desk every day, that segmenting a few weeks or a few days to do a very poorly configured firewall setup is ultimately going to cause way more time and money down the road. Mm-hmm. And if you get hit with ransomware or something like that, that's the ultimate
way,
cost,
way more.
Right, is either the data, the lifeblood of the business, or the money being paid to the ransomware to get your stuff back. Mm-hmm. So time is money.
A lot of people would wonder if they need specific manufacturer training to configure a certain manufacturer's firewall. Do you think this is the case, where if you've got a SonicWall firewall on your network, you need to be SonicWall specifically trained to sort of configure it?
In my experience, and anybody who's used any kind of computer, because that's what these are, the difference between an Android phone and an iOS and Apple device, they all do the same things. Ultimately, you're all going to send text messages, you're all going to make calls, you're all going to browse the web. It's just how it looks, how it feels, how you interact with it. The interface is going to be different between all of these different manufacturers. Mm-hmm. And from a security standpoint, they all understand the threats the same, and they're all trying to mitigate them the best way possible, which is either very similar, depending on where you go, or somebody might have something that's a little bit different that, is tried and true or something like that. So they're going to all be very similar, but they're all going to be very different. and how you interact with them, the language and the verbiage used versus general networking terminology that's kind of ubiquitous to a lot of professionals, IT professionals. Sometimes that manufacturer will change the way things, the naming convention or the layout, the structure, the steps that have to be taken to set something up. And so it does get specific. And to come in with a general knowledge is probably going to help you get a little bit down the road, but the road starts to split and go different ways. And if you're not familiar with what path you need to take, ultimately that's going to come back and bite you. So yes, the answer to that question is yes, you should definitely have the appropriate training and certifications, especially between manufacturers. Again, that's time and money too. So if it's a solution where you got to go train for 3 weeks and pass so many exams to be qualified to interact with that box, that might not have been the best use of your time. Which, at Firewalls.com, we have engineers that are specified certs and training depending on the product or the manufacturer or that kind of thing.
And so even if you've gotten a brand that you've worked on in the past and maybe you feel fairly comfortable with it, but maybe your business is moving to a different brand at this point, that doesn't mean that you can just use exactly what you knew from that other brand to do a really thorough and good configuration.
Yeah, very different between brands, without a doubt. But actually, now that you say that, that makes me think you're also going to have different versions of software just within one manufacturer. Yeah. So different firmware versions. Version 6 can be dramatically different from version 7. And while you might have been great for version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 might be, I haven't trained on this in so many years and I didn't get the latest training and certs to be comfortable doing this. And again, some knowledge might get you part of the way, but ultimately for when we're talking about your business livelihood, that's kind of a big dice to roll. So,
and I imagine the picture gets even less clear when you've got sort of mixed environment with multiple manufacturers across different appliances and you're trying to get all these systems to communicate and integrate in different ways.
Yeah, that is a very real problem that we come across regularly where, sometimes one product is the best at that time that you're making that purchase and investment, but 5 years down the road, you start going down a different path because somebody now has the latest and greatest and, is hands and arms above the next best solution that you bought 5 years ago. So making those two systems talk, not easy. Even if you're well versed, there can be, depending on firmware versions and all of those little things, those little details, that could take some serious expertise to sort that out. And we come across that all the time. And it's a good thing that people are buying the latest and greatest to keep their business safe. And, spending that money is a great use of budget to get the latest and greatest and good for peace of mind. But making sure it's configured properly when you spend tens of thousands on a firewall, if it's not configured properly, ultimately that was an expensive, paperweight. But then making that talk with your older hardware, because not everybody goes across the board and rips and replace everything they have all at one time. Just the downtime in that would be not cost effective. But yeah, it's making things talk and making them play nice together from different brands is very much a difficulty that even the professionals, come across and have to navigate.
Yeah, on your first appearance on the program, I remember we talked about the fact that some places do decide we just want everything the same brand because maybe it's a little easier to make them talk and all that kind of stuff. But then there are others out there who, even if it's not based on the fact of like a legacy product that they have, they just go, well, we want to spread this out a little bit so that we have the specialized protection that brand X offers compared to brand Y. And we want to have kind of that extra layer of security that might be there that's not if we just stick to the same brand. So it's a common issue where people are mixing and matching there.
And you said the key word, which is layers of security. Some manufacturers do certain things better than others, and having layers of security, aside from setting things up the right way with the most security-minded config and deployment, is very important. But the second most important thing would be having layers of security, because there is no one-size-fits-all best, you'll never, ever have to worry about the security risks type of product out there. And these, unethical hackers or criminals or whatever they are, they're trying to find new ways to circumvent all of this security you're putting in place. They're not doing it in the same way that, every manufacturer knows how to stop. So having those layers of security is important, because when somebody does figure something out to circumvent one type of product or solution, you have another product or solution in place behind that one to also thwart any, attempt at getting access to your network or doing damage. So layers of security, from what you said, is the second most important thing, aside from making sure that the investment that you make in hardware is also implemented correctly within your network. That's also a good investment, whether that be time or money or both. So those are the big two you want to worry about.
We talk a lot about, cyber attackers are always evolving, finding new ways to exploit things. And obviously it's not cost effective for businesses to sort of rip and replace their appliances every time a brand new model comes out to keep up. But it seems like a configuration revisit every now and then would be a pretty cheap and easy way to make sure you're staying safe. So how often would you say you should revisit your configuration and, sort of update for what new things have hit the market?
Right. And so the core of that, I would say, is, you need to revisit things to update firmware and apply the security patches that the manufacturers are rolling out because of the ever-changing threat landscape. So, the firmware that shipped with the appliance 3 or 4 years ago, if you're not making those updates or keeping your subscriptions enabled to keep those security services running, that's going to be a big problem right there. So the bare minimum, you need to revisit the firewall, the configuration, just from a firmware standpoint. And, when a 0-day threat rolls out, nobody's seen that before. All the security vendors, they're at risk from something that's never been seen before. And that's honestly what the biggest concern is. It's not the things that are known that you're preventing on a daily basis, that people are keeping, trying to recycle and reuse those same attacks. It's the stuff that's the unknown. When ransomware hit the scene, it was running rampant because, at first nobody knew exactly what the details were to make that preventative change. But as they learned and adapted, they're rolling out firmware to make those changes and prevent those things from happening.
Ransomware disappeared.
Yeah, ransomware is still here and still very dangerous. But knowing, again, being not the lowest hanging fruit is the best protection against that, and keeping your firmware up to date, keeping your security patches. That's a revisit on a config that needs to happen regularly. Aside from that, at Firewalls.com, we do a quarterly firewall review with all of our customers, with all of our managed customers. A quarterly review, a lot can change in 3 months. So that's why we do that, to revisit with a customer and say, hey, you put in a ticket asking for us to make this change or open this port. Is this something that we are still actively using, or can we close that? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times customers are like, oh man, I forgot I didn't put a ticket in to close that, that request. So the revisiting of the firewall is definitely a thing. It's not set and forget. When you make a change to allow an application or an employee or something to do something, you probably want to make a change if that's not a long-term solution that needs to be always taken care of. So make the change back to keep that security posture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if your business is always changing, whether maybe you're adding a department, maybe you switch the permissions for a department because you want this department now to handle a specific set of data or something like that, or maybe you're having issues where a certain department is misusing access to something.
Absolutely.
So those are issues that don't even have to do with the actual software firmware updates. That's just your day-to-day of your business can affect your security posture as well.
Yeah, and another thing you said right there is the internal threats, right? From either a disgruntled employee or somebody that does gain access within the building that can plug something into a workstation or a server. That's a huge threat. And the level or how granular you want to get on preventing that type of thing from happening can also disrupt some of the daily workflow of your employees, of the business. So there's various levels of that locked down mentality that, while necessary, a lot of people don't employ on a day-to-day basis. But like you're saying, giving somebody access to something, making that change internally could down the road, if their laptop gets compromised at Starbucks and comes back in within the network and brings that threat in, and they have access to the accounting data, now you're kind of in trouble. So making changes and just leaving that change because it was just a temporary request, leaving it forever, that's a big problem. So frequently revisiting things from a security posture standpoint is also very, very important.
So I imagine with the current climate, obviously with coronavirus going around, everybody rushing to work from home all of a sudden, there is likely a lot of configuration work to be done to sort of make everybody optimized for secure access. And I assume some more work to be done in the future when we have to undo all these changes we've made.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We saw a definite spike in that exact scenario where we have our engineering team inundated with tickets because everybody needs to be able to access certain things from home, from their VPN on their workstation, their laptop, from across the world. Nobody's traveling anymore. A lot of meetings aren't taking place face to face. You're doing presentations and sharing documents, through a conference. Those type of scenarios were and still are. That's a constantly changing thing where you have remote workers all over the world or the country or the state or whatever. That's always going to be changing too, especially when you're hiring new people. There's always going to be new rules and policies that have to take place. So that was a huge change in how companies were operating, making everybody go remote. And that doesn't just happen with the flip of a switch. There's a lot of either hardware that needs to be put in place, some structure that needs to be put in place, and sometimes you're rushing to do that and you kind of forget the security aspect of it, which is easy to do, especially, as fast as, pandemic kind of swept the country or the world. To have all of that front of mind when you're trying to make the business still function on a daily basis is difficult. And, honestly, that's another reason why having qualified professionals either on your team or have access to through some kind of managed solution is very important, because they do keep that thing front of mind, because it's the only thing that they're doing day in and day out. They're not doing all of the other things that, an IT admin is doing on a daily basis. Break fix and email and all of that kind of stuff.
So you talked about, and we've talked about throughout this conversation, some of the pitfalls of misconfiguration. But to sum it up a little bit more, what are some of the big issues that are most responsible for breaches? Yeah,
there's definitely big no-nos that take place and they happen. So security services lapsing. Almost every manufacturer of an appliance, a security appliance, has some type of subscription-based security. Letting those services lapse, in most cases, gets all of those features turned off. Things like intrusion prevention, your gateway AV and malware protection, even down to your content filtering policies. Having those things all lapse, get turned off, you have 100 employees, nobody's protected. That's a lot of different places employees are going and can go. That opens you up to the dangers of cyber threats. So security services being disabled or not being renewed properly, huge thing. A lot of people implement like a global policy, so that all of the rules and policies that they put in place apply to the president of the company, to the newest, lowest person in the company. And generally, that's not a good idea. You don't want global policies almost ever. You want to get as granular as you can. And different groups and policies for those groups is very, very important. Not having the appropriate layers in place, like we mentioned. If you have now a lot of remote workers connecting back to your network, no endpoint protection in place, if their machine gets compromised, the whole company's at risk now. That's a big no-no. And kind of the universal fix-all for networking would be an any-all type policy implemented, which gives anyone any access to all of the things, and either within your own network or access to everything out there on the web, which obviously is a wormhole that can lead to a big time and money sink if anything does happen. So off the top of my head, those are a few things that I would say. You could also throw not connecting through a properly set up or encrypted VPN channel. That's, in the current climate, that's very important to have all your users that are remote, making sure that that traffic is protected and encrypted. And you can even go, you can kind of go to the 10th degree on that by having any traffic that they're doing, just browsing the web, going backhauled through the firewall, run through the security policies, run through the content filtering policies before they can actually get access to that stuff. So you can get as granular as you want. The more granular, the better for security, but not always the best for functionality and latency and that kind of stuff.
So the any all setup particularly seems most like a common sense kind of thing. If you buy a brand new alarm system, you want to actually activate it instead of leaving it all turned off to make it easier for everyone. So
it's a good way to put it, yeah.
Right, just leaving the doors unlocked to make it easier.
And sometimes it is a quick fix in a certain scenario where something has to work right now. We don't have time to drill down all the way into the very core of the problem. So you implement an any all for maybe one specific user or IP address, and when they're done doing what they're doing, you turn that back off. But that's another one of those like set and forget things that you generally don't want to set and forget. It's pretty dangerous.
So one question I see from a lot of our customers, especially when they're buying a new appliance, is can I sort of port over my config from the last one to this new appliance? Is that something you would consider a best practice?
It's not a best practice. Definitely not a best practice. The one thing that you would be doing that at its, the very base level is you might be bringing over a lot of old, outdated policies that were still active on that firewall, and you're rolling them right into the new solution. So you're not cleaning up any of, the mess that's been created over however many years. Another reason to not do that, you get different firmware versions, even if you maybe can import an older firmware version, that doesn't always play nice with, all the different rules and policies and site-to-site VPN connections and access for all of the users over various platforms and that kind of thing. When you just roll that into a new box, probably later, newer firmware version, you can break a lot of things, and then we're back to the troubleshooting and the time, money scenario that ultimately you don't want to go down if you don't have to.
Right. So I guess one last thing on the configuration topic. We've been talking about firewalls in particular, but if you get a network switch, there are some other appliances that you may need to think about configuration of as well when you're filling out your network.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk firewalls, generally that's the gateway. That's the very first point of the network that's going out to the World Wide Web. But anything behind that firewall, whether that be like you're saying, a switch, sometimes even your wireless access points. If you have a purpose-built box, maybe for your email security or some DDoS protection or something like that, sometimes changing things on the firewall can ultimately impact everything behind the firewall, not just users. You can even go down to probably a printer level where sometimes you break things and then you've got 10 people knocking on the door saying, why can't I print? But yeah, there's a wave effect where making some changes on the firewall, since it's the very, very front of the network, can roll that wave back, to everything on the network as well. And even from a set and forget standpoint, wireless, there's a lot of things that change in a Wi-Fi solution, and making sure that you have the best strength and radios and channels and all those things that you can change over time from the devices your end users are using, that can make an impact on overall performance and overall throughput and speed. And that's another reason, if I may go back to the beginning of that configuration wizard, the overall performance of the appliance. So having things not set up properly can diminish the performance of the firewall greatly. And then therefore everything behind the network, the switches, the wireless, everything like that. So, you're paying top dollar for a high-end, top security solution. You want the most performance you can get. And that's another place where expertise and training can play a big role in getting you that gigabit connection you're paying for from your ISP, making sure that you can use all of that and provide the best performance for your workers on a daily basis, that they're not being bottlenecked or held back from getting things done as fast as possible, because time is money.
Tony, thanks very much for joining us again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Stay safe, everybody. Make sure you're checking all the right boxes.
Now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at a few top stories in the cybersecurity world and what they may mean to you. Now for headline number 1. 1 in 3 employees believe their company's cybersecurity is a moderate or major problem. So this information comes from a recent survey and report done by New Lab of employees at companies of varying size. In addition to that 1 in 3 number, another big number is 76%, as in 3 in 4 employees say there's at least some degree of a cybersecurity problem. So an additional 45% or so on top of that 1/3 still thinks there's an issue.
Right, just not as pressing as the 1/3 believes. So this was in response to a survey from New Lab. It was given to 1,000 full-time employees that spend at least 4 hours per day using a computer. So I'd say most jobs these days, 4 hours on a computer is not unheard of. Respondents were made up of about 53% male, 46% female, so fairly even split.
Basically, the takeaway here is that if you're in leadership in your company, then you probably need to show leadership on cybersecurity issues, not only to protect yourself, but to make your employees and maybe potential future employees a little more comfortable about working there.
Right. So overall, 15% of employees believed that the data of the company was insecure, and that number sort of skewed higher the smaller business you went, so to speak. So only 9% at companies of 1,000 or more believe this, whereas at a company the size of 1 to 50 employees is closer to 23%.
Yeah, so this story that we're working off of is in Small Business Trends. So we mentioned that this survey involved companies of varying size, but the focus here is on that small business situation. The article points out that more than a quarter of cyber attacks target small businesses, and since 99% of all U.S. businesses fall into that category, that's a lot of cyber attacks.
And I'd say the perhaps more worrying stat here is that 44% of these employees say that their employers are slightly or not at all responsive to these issues. So at these small businesses especially, they feel like their data is not secure, and when they bring up those concerns, pretty much just being ignored on this.
Right. And again, as you mentioned, the digital data insecurity question, the highest number of concern happened in that 1 to 50 employee business, and the same thing happened in that particular question in terms of responsiveness. The smaller the business generally, the less responsive they were to any cybersecurity concerns.
Now, do you believe this is a matter of perception, where perhaps if you're at a place with, 1,000 employees, you kind of just assume somebody's taking care of that stuff? Whereas if you're in a business of 20 people, you can kind of look around and say, hey, who around here is worried about this?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. And the smaller the business, the less likely there is a dedicated IT leadership kind of situation where people, know who to talk to and know that person X is handling our cybersecurity and does this, and this. So there's definitely perception. But if you look at another question in this survey, they ask whether these employees have confronted their employers about poor workplace cybersecurity. 42% say they have. So if you take that 42% that say they have and then judge that based off of that responsiveness question, then
that's true.
It may not just be perception.
That's correct. That's actually a stat that surprised me, is that 42% of these employees had actually gone to their bosses and said, hey, something does not feel quite right with our cybersecurity here. So it's interesting how forefront of mind cybersecurity issues are in the day-to-day lives of people that aren't even IT anymore.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible that this could be a little over-reported, too, as they want to sound like the cybersecurity heroes of the world. But
of course I brought this up.
Yeah.
Just last week.
Mm-hmm. Regardless, I think we've talked about this a decent amount, that cybersecurity issues are in the news now all the time. And even if maybe the leadership isn't paying as close attention, you are more likely to have rank and file employees noticing this stuff and maybe noticing that something's not quite right on your end in the office.
I think one of the most, wise suggestions in this article for improving this stat of workplace cybersecurity concerns involved a regular security training for employees, and that sort of works on both ends, where the line in front employees believe that they've got more training, that means they'll be able to better protect themselves, and also the executives up top are able to say, well, my employees are better trained, I should probably believe their concerns when they bring them up at this point.
Right, and it goes to that perception and the culture in place that your business has. If your employees see that you are doing this training on a regular basis, then there you go. There's your perception that cybersecurity is a priority because you're taking time to get them up to speed and keep them up to speed as time goes on.
Right, and especially as we live in a world now where one of the biggest threats is phishing and social engineering, having that sort of workplace culture and training in place is very important, because those are your biggest targets as a business, is going to be the people.
Yeah, the people are what generally let in the ransomware and lead to the business email compromise situations and lead to the financial losses. The Better Business Bureau, cited in this story, indicates that small businesses lose an average of $80,000 a year on cybercrime. And we've heard a lot of other numbers that sometimes are much bigger than that. But regardless,
80,000 seems like on the smaller side from what we hear on a week-to-week basis. So.
Yeah, and we've heard of the businesses closing in 6 months once they get a cyber attack happening. So regardless, it's a priority, and it needs to be a priority for leadership of small businesses too. On to headline number 2. U.S. charges former Uber security chief with covering up massive 2016 hacking. And Uber, in this case, does not mean the biggest, baddest security chief ever. It actually is related to the company Uber. A former chief security officer for Uber was criminally charged with attempting to cover up a 2016 hack that exposed personal info of the company's 57 million customers and drivers.
So the DOJ, Department of Justice, is charging Joseph Sullivan with felony obstruction of justice, claiming that Sullivan took deliberate steps to hide this breach from the Federal Trade Commission. And this is basically the first such case of its kind where a executive is being criminally charged in response to a security breach of this sort.
Yeah, in response to kind of sweeping it under the rug, more or less. And interesting, the Federal Trade Commission, we just talked about them in our last episode, keeping tabs on the number of cyber attacks. So I guess that follows in line and sort of tells us how they're getting the information because people are compelled to do it. And they should be even more compelled now.
Quite compelling. So this is a kind of funny story, I'd say, how they tried to do the cover-up. I could see them arguing in court how they were just being the good guys through all this, but it's a little shady one way or the other. So back in, I believe it was 2016, there was 57 million customers' data had been exposed to some hackers, and those hackers were then paid off with $100,000 under the guise of a bug bounty program.
Yeah, that was interesting. But Uber did this without telling anybody that there was actually an attack, and the bounty program not really designed to cover actual theft of data.
Right, and this $100,000 figure is also much higher than any previous bug bounty payouts, so I wouldn't say it's part of the regular program scope per se.
Yeah, the complaint by the DOJ actually says that Mr. Sullivan had the hackers sign non-disclosure agreements that falsely stated they had not stolen data. In past interviews, security staff said the Uber payout was intended to force the hackers into the open to accept the money and to ensure that the data that was stolen, including the driver's license information on Uber drivers, was destroyed.
Right, so Uber's taking the position that they were the heroes in all of this for magically coaxing the hackers out into the open to make their payment. Otherwise, they might not have known who these people were at all. The FBI does note that these two main attackers involved did go on to attack other companies after Uber, so it seems bringing them into the light of day didn't do a whole lot of good.
Yeah, it didn't work. I don't know if that $100,000 was maybe a reverse incentive in that regard. I don't know.
Perhaps so.
But the current Uber leadership is actually responsible for disclosing the payoff and firing Sullivan and a deputy after learning the extent of the breach. Uber had to pay out $148 million to settle claims by all 50 U.S. states and Washington, D.C. that it had been slow to reveal the hack. So that $100,000 did not save them that much money overall.
Yeah, drop in the bucket to the later lawsuit settlements. So the way this bug bounty program usually works is white hat hackers will sort of search for vulnerabilities in a company's systems and report those flaws so that the companies can then patch them up and make sure that actual attackers aren't using them. But in this case, this is more of an attack and sort of retroactively saying, well, that is a bug that you found.
Definitely is.
Right.
Yeah, the CEO at the time was allegedly aware of Sullivan's actions as well, though no charges associated with him as of now. It is funny that they supposedly got them to sign NDAs. they didn't steal anything.
Right. Yeah. So Joseph Sullivan, before working at Uber, was also chief of security at Facebook and is now currently the chief information security officer at Cloudflare. So he is still out there doing his thing.
Yeah, and he definitely would have a lot to lose if these charges are proven in court and anything does occur in terms of punishment for him. So the case generally, it's suggesting that we know companies already do pay hackers to get their files back after a ransomware attack, and there are other payments that occur to hackers as well. But it's underlining the fact that even if you do pay, it doesn't mean you can pretend that nothing happened. You still have to tell the FTC about the attack.
You're just exempt from reporting your losses now.
Yeah, and the other big piece of this puzzle, of course, is this is actually showing some real-world consequences for the common action that a lot of companies take, which is to pretend nothing happened and hope that nobody finds out about any of these cyber attacks. So now if you are thinking about doing that, maybe there's a little bit more of a reason not to go that direction and just be transparent.
Yeah, this is quite a shift from the Equifax hack where nobody was really charged for anything and there was some light slap on the wrist kind of fees and fines, and then everybody just moved on with their life. So maybe this change in enforcement will shift how executive level decision makers are sort of thinking of cybersecurity.
Ooh, and that sounds like a tease. On to headline number 3. CEOs could be held personally liable for cyber attacks that kill. That definitely was a tease that you dropped in there at the end of the last story, perhaps directly leading out from there. Research firm Gartner predicts that 75% of top leadership at companies will be held personally responsible for cyber physical security, aka CSP, incidents by 2024, especially those that kill.
Yeah, so Gartner predicted that 75% of a company's executive team may in fact be held liable for these security incidences by 2024. Not 100% sure where the timeline is derived from that, but that's the secrets of Gartner.
Yeah, and I'm not sure where the 75% comes from either, but...
There wasn't a whole lot of methodology explanation in this article, no.
But they do predict things, and a lot of times Gartner's predictions do come true, so...
Right.
Basically, it's saying that one of the excuses I don't think we mentioned in our last story that Sullivan had was that he consulted with the legal team at Uber to proceed accordingly to the way that he did. But Gartner is saying those legal teams are not going to provide you much cover if you're leadership in the future, and don't know what that really means to the future of corporate legal teams. That may be a way to save money for the CEOs in that way, shape, or form going forward.
Yeah, just cut the legal team. So this statistic that they're talking about is in regards to, as you said, the cyber physical security event, which is defined as an event affecting a system that is engineered to orchestrate the sensing, computation, control, networking, or analytics to interact with the physical world. So in somewhere where a connected device and the physical world interact in a meaningful way.
And a couple of examples of that right now are, public utilities, other sensitive utilities, and of course the healthcare industry, which unfortunately they come up a lot in any story that we talk about as vulnerable to potential breach.
Right, and they warn that these sort of exploitable CPS incidents will become more and more common with the expansion of 5G, which will multiply the number of internet things and, as they call it, operational technology that businesses utilize, and there will definitely be more sort of interactive points between these enterprise networks and the humans that they affect.
The big takeaway here is that the more technology is being integrated, the more vulnerable every aspect of a business is. So these operational technology systems in the past and in the current form in a lot of places are separated from the corporate network and the IoT devices that are on the network as well. But in some cases, they are not separated, and there are ways for a hacker, if they want to get access to these operational technology systems, which then can lead to some actual physical issues coming up.
Including death. Right. So Gartner predicts that the financial impact of these security events that result in fatalities specifically will reach more than $50 billion by 2023. So this statistic includes loss of life compensation, insurance, regulatory fines, and reputation loss, which is a bit more of an abstract number to estimate, but Gartner has done it.
It's an abstract number, but it's definitely a number that happens with any kind of high-profile situation.
Right.
Especially, you would think, one that could lead to loss of life. So Gartner says governments and regulators will jump to action in regards to any of these types of attacks even more in the future. And that means the CEOs, CIOs, any other CEO combination, they're going to be bearing the brunt of a situation like this when it comes to consequences.
Right, and this probably has to do with the fact that a lot of these breaches are happening in the private industry, so it's one of those things, well, if we're going to shoulder all the risk on the private industry, you also need to take those consequences as well, and can't really socialize those out to everybody else's problems. So Thielman, one of the researchers at Gartner, in a media statement said that in the U.S., the FBI, NSA, and CISA have already increased the frequency and details provided around threats to critical infrastructure-related systems, most of which are owned by the private industry.
Yeah, and getting a little bit more into the types of incidents that we're talking about. Gartner is saying incidents can quickly lead to a physical harm to people in these environments where operational technology is more integrated. That can lead to not only harm to people, destruction of property, or environmental disasters. And they are predicting that these incidents will rapidly increase in the coming years due to a lack of security focus and spending currently aligning to these assets.
Right, and Gartner does make some suggestions as far as best practices to minimize the cyber physical security event space. So take stock of all of your IT, IoT, and operational technology equipment in your organizations. So this is stuff like building management tools and smart appliances, and just sort of knowing what all you have on your network, what all you're responsible for is a pretty good starting spot.
Yeah, any type of visibility is a good place to start, and then develop a classification method that takes the physical aspects of data and systems into consideration rather than just a classification scheme. And then deploy an awareness campaign to ensure your stakeholders inside and outside the organization are aware of those cyber physical risks from those connected systems.
Yeah, you got to come up with a sort of, awareness campaign that ranks how deadly a different technology may be in the workplace. Thermostat, pretty low.
Yeah, but you mentioned this. The 5G expansion is listed as a reason for the expansion of this particular threat occurring. So you've got your smart buildings, your smart cities, your connected cars, your automated cars, and telehealth, all of those things. It really just makes you think that all of these advances in technology are maybe a little scary sometimes.
Yeah, this 5G is quite controversial launch. Maybe we should just skip straight to 6G. 5G is a little messy so far.
Yeah.
It's time for our second edition of Ransomware Reckoning, in which our Firewalls.com colleague Andrew Nita shines a spotlight on a high-profile ransomware case. Because, unfortunately, there are plenty to choose from. This one, though, has a bit of a twist.
A Russian hacker has been charged with offering a $1 million bribe to a Tesla employee to smuggle malware into the company's Gigafactory in Nevada. The 27-year-old Russian hacker tried to convince an unnamed employee to plant the malware in Tesla's computer system so that he could launch a distributed denial of service attack. The DDoS attack was designed to be a distraction for Tesla's security team, and while they were distracted, the hacking team planned to steal vital information to hold ransom. According to the Department of Justice, the meeting between the hacker and the Tesla employee took place in Sparks, Nevada, in a local hotel room. Fortunately, the unnamed Tesla employee supposedly wore a wire to the meeting and turned the information over to the FBI. The Russian hacker is currently facing up to 5 years in a United States prison with the charges of conspiracy to intentionally cause damage to a protected computer.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. And thanks again to Anthony Mershow for joining us. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed in this episode. Subscribe or follow now however you listen to ensure you get our latest as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode, but in the meantime, we remind you to get secure, stay secure.